Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I wish I was there in person with you. I have had great experiences at Beijing Forestry University, and I look forward to my next visit. This talk is focused on career development, and this was the title that was given to me. And what I'd like to do is spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about really three topics. What are some of the attributes of successful scientists? Meaning, what have been some characteristics of successful scientists in all disciplines over the past many decades and even centuries? The next one is communicating your work. And then the third, what's it like if you go on to an academic position and those first few years as a lecturer or a faculty member? Now, this lecture is based on several small commentaries or little viewpoint papers I've had over the last few years listed here, and you can download these on my website. And then in the past few months, a book has come out that kind of summarizes these and other topics related to navigating an academic career, this brief guide, and I'll show you a little more about the book later. But this is published in 2020 by Wiley and American Geophysical Union. So this is the plan for the next 45 minutes, and then I hope there'll be time for questions and discussion, either through the chat feature or if you want to unmute yourself, however might work best. Okay, now in addition, of course, there's not just things I've been writing, but many people have been writing on this topic of launching an academic career, guidance to PhD students and early career people. Nature has had several special issues on this topic. They have a regular careers column, as does Science, has a working life column, and then many books as well. You see several here. One I draw your attention to in the bottom right, called Academic Duty by Donald Kennedy. He was president of Stanford University and later editor-in-chief of Science magazine. He died of the COVID-19, sadly, a couple of months ago, but he's really written the definitive work, Academic Duty, and that's a very good book if you're interested in. But what I'm trying to say is that there are many perspectives on this, and it's important to maybe think about various bits of advice rather than only one person like me. But I'm going to do my best to give you maybe a sense of what I think are the big factors for early career navigation. Now, of course, there's so much joy and happiness when you finish your PhD, or maybe some of you are postdocs going on to an academic career. But along the way, before you finish, there can be some stress and anxiety, and it's not uncommon to feel that. This is a study that came out in 2017, I believe. It surveyed 3,600 PhD students in Belgium, in Europe, and found a very high incidence of mental health problems with PhD students. More than half had mental health issues through their PhD. This means that these kinds of anxiety and other even more severe issues that PhD students face are common given the unique aspects of navigating a PhD and thinking about next steps. So it's important not to suffer in silence and to know that you're not alone if you're feeling some anxiety, for instance. Now, some of the anxiety is due to graphs like this. This is a plot. On the x-axis is years, on the y-axis is the cumulative number in blue of the PhDs awarded, and in the orange color, this is the number of faculty positions that grow at universities around the world. So what you can see is that when I got my PhD in 1989, the difference between the blue and the orange wasn't that great, but each year it gets wider and wider. Now, you are very fortunate in China, I think, and being at a school like Beijing Forestry University, where if you want to become a faculty member in China and you are flexible about where you want to go and be a lecturer, you have probably the highest odds of anywhere currently in the world, because China is growing and there's many academic positions that are on offer. But around the world, the story is slightly different. In Canada, a recent survey showed that about 1/3 of PhD graduates got jobs as faculty members, with half of them needing to move out of Canada to be able to secure that job. So the numbers vary, of course, depending on the field or subfield, but I think in China, you are in probably as good a position as anywhere currently. All right, so I talked about 3 sections to this talk. This is the first section, attributes of successful scientists. So I think as a PhD student, it's good to reflect on other scientists who've come before you, to think about what is science, how can one adopt some ways that have been successful in past times. This is a kind of a definition of what research is that I really like. This is by a Nobel Prize winner, Albert Szent-Györgyi. He was a Hungarian biochemist. He was the first to synthesize vitamin C. And this quote is, "Research is to see what everyone else has seen and thinking what no one else has thought." To me, this is the best description of what research is all about. And I think as a PhD student, a great way to kind of think about the academic enterprise from a research point of view. Research is to see what everyone else has seen and thinking what no one else has thought. Now, the other aspect, I think, of early career success and thinking about being a productive and happy PhD student is that you need to really be generating ideas. And to have a good idea, you need to have a lot of ideas. Not necessarily a lot of good ideas, although that's what you're hoping for, but you're trying to bathe yourself each day with ideas. And these ideas often come through activities that are away from your desk, on a bike ride through campus, on your way to work, in nature, a walk, things that often are periods of time where ideas will come to you. This has been discussed for many decades. This is a book from the 1950s by a professor from Cambridge University, Beveridge. He wrote this book, The Art of Scientific Investigation. And this book is as relevant today as it was 70 or more years ago. And he talked about ways to get ideas. And one is skim reading, meaning you're trying to absorb a wide range of material and thinking about these papers or books or things even unrelated to your topics. But through reading comes ideas. And it's linking up ideas whose connection was not previously suspected. So think about Darwin and origin of the species, natural selection. He was reading in economics and finding connections with other disciplines that hadn't been previously understood in his discipline, in biology and geology. Another way is using analogy, looking for similarities to suggest clues and hypotheses, especially if you're working on things that you can't physically see easily. I'm a hydrologist. I study the water movement through forested landscapes. A lot of it is underground, and using analogy as a way to think about how water is cycling underground that is not possible to see. The other thing I think it's important to recognize early on is that successful scientists work on important problems. This is a white paper available on the web. You can find it by someone named Richard Hamming. He wasn't a Nobel Prize winner, but he worked with Nobel laureates. And this was a paper called You and Your Research. And one quote from it, and again, I highly recommend this short paper that you can find on the web. he said, if you do not work on an important problem, it's unlikely you'll do important work. In other words, thinking early about how your topic relates to a subject, an area, a problem of importance, and how you're going to advance is really the key. I take part in a review periodically with the Helmholtz Association in Germany. This is a research organization. They are funded to about the amount of about 7 billion euros per year, so a very large research organization. Their motto is research for grand challenges. Their motto isn't research for little narrow topics that only I'm interested in. No, they're going after grand challenges. How can you think about your work in the context of the grand challenges in your field? This is something to ponder and think about. Going back to Beveridge, one characteristic of most successful scientists is this thing called indomitable spirit. The spirit of indomitable perseverance has characterized nearly all successful scientists. What do I mean by that? It means impossible to subdue or defeat. Maybe what we would call in the West these days grit. Never give up. I'm in the field of hydrology, and we have a colleague, Keith Bevan, who is the world's most cited hydrologist, who's just retired from Lancaster University in the UK. He sent off his first paper to a Journal of Hydrology, and it was rejected. But he had grit. He reworked the paper. He resubmitted it to another journal, and this paper has become one of the most highly cited papers of all time, outlining something called top model, which has been a very, very influential model over the years. The idea is that every scientist faces setbacks, and this idea of grit, or this indomitable perseverance, is so important. This came out some time ago in the magazine The Economist, and there was a follow-up paper in Nature, and you can find it if you do a bit of web searching. And it talks about success in academic research is as much about grit as it is talent. And here's what they did. They followed several scientists, and these were American scientists that had received or not received NIH funding. NIH is National Institutes of Health. So they looked at the ones that were able to win an NIH grant, but just barely, and those that were not funded just barely. Meaning, just like in China and around the world, you submit a proposal, they rank them, and then they have usually a cutoff because there's a limited amount of money to give out. And then some just are successful and some are just not successful. They followed these scientists over 5 years and 10 years, you see in the graph at the bottom. And what was interesting was the ones that had the near misses, they had average number of citations based on Google Scholar higher than the ones who had near wins. Why is that? It's grit. It's this indomitable spirit. This can really propel a scientist. And I think understanding this as a PhD student can be very powerful, to know that setbacks are common and that this characteristic called grit has been important in science since science started in the 1600s. Okay, the second topic I want to talk about is communicating your work. So you're starting out as a PhD student, and there are many other PhD students who are doing research, and there are increasing numbers each year of researchers in a given field. How do you get your voice heard? One way to think about it is developing something of a research brand identity. This is like a central question that might drive your research. You might have a few sub-questions. For me, for the last 30 years, I've had 3 questions. Where does water go when it rains? What flow path does that water take to the stream? And how old is that water in the channel? you're going to have different questions that relate to an overall umbrella research area. And it's the thing you want to be truly excellent at. And it's your research focus as a PhD student. It's more, we might say, aspirational. It's kind of like your career vision, and it's thinking strategically in a way about a few key areas you want to make a difference in over a sustained period of time. Now, starting out, how do you do this? Well, increasingly you'll find in journals there are commentary papers or perspectives. These are often written by early career people, a PhD student maybe just about to finish, or a postdoc, or an early career lecturer. A review paper linked to your research area. Many PhD students will say, oh, I'm not qualified to write a review paper. I would say that maybe you are most qualified to write a review paper early in your career because you are so on top of the literature at that stage. I've had a few of my PhD students identify a key area that needed review. There was so-called pent-up demand for that particular topic to be reviewed, meaning it hadn't been reviewed in a long time. And this enabled them to lead a review paper that enabled them to really become the authority on the topic upon graduation. Editing a special issue of a journal, this happens in early career, maybe with your advisor or with other collaborators. What I encourage all of my PhD students to do is to organize a session at a conference like AGU, fall meeting. This is a meeting linked to the geosciences. You probably have other meetings, and we have many, many small sessions, and these are often led by early career people. The idea is to do as many of these as you can, because the whole point is to show academic leadership early on in your career. When a hiring committee is looking for a new lecturer, they're looking for a quality person who is going to be a leader in the future, and showing evidence of that can be very helpful. Now, again, in terms of your research and what you want to do, what you can do, I like this phrase, only do what only you can do. Meaning, what are the unique things that you can bring to your research area? Maybe you have very strong quantitative skills in a research area that hasn't had much quantitative component to it. Or maybe you have very good field skills and you can really focus on that. What is it that you love to do, that you're very good at, and only you can do? I had a PhD student here at the University of Saskatchewan, and he had an undergraduate in cell biology. And he was worried as a PhD student that he would be at a disadvantage where other PhD students around him had bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering. This phrase we talked about a lot, and this resulted in him doing some early PhD work, linking his background in cell biology with hydrology, and his first paper was a Nature paper, which was really came down to fully embracing this phrase. What could he bring from his unique cell biology background to a topic in hydrology? These are powerful ways to think about really innovation in science. Another aspect of communication is the so-called elevator pitch. Someone asks you, what do you do? It could be at a poster session at a conference. It could be in the elevator with the dean of your school or the head of your department. And usually, certainly I found this in early career, someone would say, what do you do? And I would say, well, I do this, and I do this, and I do this, and I do this. And all of a sudden their eyes start to glaze over because I'm just saying too many things that I do. There is a way to do this, at least in English, and I'm sure there are parallels in all languages, and it's through a way of storytelling that's called the and, but, therefore approach. This comes from a book by Randy Olson. He was a a professor in New Hampshire. He gave up science. He went to Hollywood. He went to film school at University of Southern California, and he became a documentary filmmaker. And this is a book that he's written for scientists to describe his experience. And the way he says is that you don't want to say, I do this and this and this. You want to say, I do this and this, but this, therefore this. Let me give you one example. Here's a good example from the book. In my lab, we were studying sleep apnea using rats as our model system. And we've been focused on physiological mechanisms. But lately, we've realized that the real controls may lie at the molecular level in the central nervous system. So as a result, or therefore, we've begun exploring novel molecular pathways. This is a way to tell a story, engage the listener. And I'd encourage all of you PhD students out there, or even early faculty, to think about how you would fill in the blanks for your research. How would you do that in the next day or so? Just describing in a paragraph your and, but, therefore, perhaps in this context. And of course, we need to do this at different levels. The words you'd use, the level of jargon, the level of detail would be very different to a colleague in your field compared to maybe, I don't know, someone in another department, or maybe a relative who doesn't have a science background. The idea is to have many versions of this that you can use to communicate what you do, because you never know which meeting is going to be so important to your career and your advancement. Now, the other part of communication, of course, is the most obvious one maybe, and that's paper writing. Here's a quote from Darwin. This autobiography is free on the internet. You can read it. I really, really recommend it. It's very, very good. A scientist's life would be a happy one if they had only to observe and never to write. So here's Darwin saying, I don't want to write papers, I just want to collect data. So this is not a new thing, this aversion to writing papers. Now, I had real struggles with papers in my early career, and I had many papers, but they were all unfinished. So I had more unfinished papers than finished papers. So I would start writing at the on the keyboard at the beginning, starting with the introduction, and I'd work my way to the methods and the results and the discussion. But even with that broad structure, I would kind of find dead ends along the way. So what I've adopted with my group is this top-down approach to paper writing, where every time a PhD student or a postdoc wants to write a paper, we play a role where they pitch the paper to me. They tell me what the story they want to tell, and I give them feedback before any writing starts. And it's always the same three things to structure the pitch or the story. What's the status quo? What's wrong with the status quo? And how does the paper go beyond the status quo? What do I mean by that? The status quo is, what's the literature out there? So it forces the person wanting to write the paper to know the literature. And to not only know the literature, but critically to know what's wrong with the literature right now. Where are the gaps? Where are the holes, the grand challenges? So that's the what's wrong with the status quo part. And then you can say how the paper goes beyond the status quo. And it's really in an introduction to a paper, I think, the way to really capture the reader, to get your voice known, is to have equal weighting of these parts to show why yet another paper is needed in some area of forestry or hydrology or whatever your field is. So we have many meetings on this topic, and we have a whiteboard session where we try to refine and hone and edit this pitch of the story. And of course, this is how the introduction is set up. The introduction flows in this way, and it ends with the individual objectives of the paper. So what we do then is iterate on this outline. We start to identify the 6 or 7 or 8 key figures. We write subheadings and subheadings of each of the main paper sections. Again, intro, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. And we populate that with enough detail that we can stand back and take the 10,000 meter view of the paper along with the title and see if it's really vibrating on the right frequency, if the ideas are resonating. And this is, I think, is a way to greatly speed along the process of writing, because once you've edited this many, many times, now the paper is sort of filling in the blanks in terms of how to write it. Basically, the subheadings become the paragraph topics. And I find that rather than 100% of the time being my typing that got me down to dead-end roads along the way, now for the papers that I work on and I work on with my group, I'll spend about equal parts working on the outline, writing, and then self-editing. What is self-editing? That is going over your writing that you use to quickly get down on paper and then hone it, polish the apple so that by the time you submit it, it's really a well-edited document. So this is not something I did in early career, but it's something that's only really come clear to me over the many decades and many PhD students and postdocs I've had in my lab. Okay, the last section of this little talk is, what is it like in your first few years as a lecturer? I'm assuming that the audience here is considering an academic career. Of course, there are many other fantastic careers for someone with a PhD from Beijing Forestry University. I'm going to focus on the academic career track and what that's like. And there's really a couple of things that are very, I don't know, obvious in a way. It's do high quality work and publish early and often. It's kind of like saving for retirement. The work you do now in early career pays huge dividends later on just because of the magic of compounding. So not only like compound interest on a bank account or an investment, compounding on your citations with early high quality publications can really be effective and has a big influence on the difference between people's rise in their careers. At least I've found that. This is your productive time. This is a heat map. This came out in Science a couple of years ago. On the x-axis is career length. So here I'm at 30. You're down around 0, 1, 2. And you can see that in terms of the number of faculty and the productivity histogram on the y-axis, now is your productive time. Now is when these are your most productive years of your career. If you look at these years here, maybe 0 is your PhD year of graduation. So this is your productive time, and that's why it's so important to use this time wisely. Now I might say, because this can be very depressing to an older professor like me, the good thing is for all people at all career stages is this graph. This is on the x-axis going from your first to your last paper, and this is basically saying that any point in your career you could have your most important paper. So this is the thing that keeps me going, hoping that my most important paper is still in me somehow over the next perhaps 10 years or so. Okay. Your job as you transition to from PhD student to researcher, your main job is to become an idea generator. Remember, to have a good idea, you need to have a lot of ideas. And we talked a little bit before about where ideas come from. But this is very important to realize that this being creative is more important than knowledge. This is a quote often attributed to Einstein. And it doesn't mean that tools and techniques and understanding of mathematical approaches and so on are that kind of knowledge is not important, but in research, it's all about creativity. It's going back to that saying, research is to see what everyone else has seen, but thinking what no one else has thought. It's also recognizing, and hopefully, if you're a PhD student, you've already recognized this, that perfection is the enemy of good, meaning you cannot be a perfectionist in this field because that will hold you back. A good dissertation is a done dissertation. A perfect dissertation is neither. That's an old saying that suggests that if you suffer from perfectionist tendencies, that will really hold you back in a field where you're always getting critical feedback and always improving. You can't wait for it to be perfect and then introduce it to the world. It needs to be very good, your best work, but it's not going to be perfect because everything gets criticized. And to be okay with criticism is an important trait. Also, as a PhD student, you are there because you've already shown your ability to work hard. Where it really makes a difference in early career is balancing equal measures of hard work and focus. So rather than spreading yourself on multiple tasks through the day, think about how you're going to prioritize and be strategic. I do a daily to-do list, but it's more than just a to-do list. I estimate the time each task will take, and I rank each task, and I develop a new one each day. And that keeps me focused so that if I work hard, I can be achieving what I want to achieve through a day. Another one, this is a small equation that I've found very helpful. This is by a writer in the New York Times called Thomas Friedman. The creativity quotient plus the passion quotient is greater than the intelligence quotient. This, I think, is something I would never have thought was true when I was a PhD student, but I've seen evidence of this over the years in academia. The creativity, the passion for what you do really is even more important than your overall IQ. So this is, I think, a very important one. Now, the distractions are everywhere in early career. You go from a PhD student to a lecturer at a university, all of a sudden now, in addition to your research, you have teaching and committees and your own students and many other things. This is a quote by a former US president. What is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important. And we would say in this context, papers are the urgent thing, or papers are the important thing, but they rarely seem urgent, whereas the urgent things like a committee meeting or a deadline for this or that is not really important in the longer scheme of things in your career. So this is, I think, a useful quote to reflect on. Now, one way to keep your main thing the main thing, to keep focused on what is important in your scientific career, and that is your written record. This is something I call the 1 hour workday. So when you're a lecturer, unlike being a PhD student where you might have many hours or even the whole day to be focused and uninterrupted and undistracted, as a new lecturer, you're distracted by so many things. Again, these committees, teaching, the many other things. I found as a very young professor, I would go to work and I would come home and my wife would say to me, "So how was your day?" And I would say, "Oh, I got nothing done." And she would say, "What? You were just at the office for 14 hours. What do you mean you got nothing done?" And what I meant was I got nothing done on my own work or writing. So this idea is something that's developed for me over the years. I call it the 1 hour workday, and it's identifying an hour. Maybe it's a little more, sometimes it could be less, but every day you've got a window in your day where you are focused on your writing. Now, as a PhD student, this might only apply to your, I don't know, final year of your PhD, where you're really focused on getting your papers out. If you're a postdoc, I think this probably applies, but certainly as a young faculty member, you're wanting to keep in condition. You're like an Olympic athlete, and you want to keep fit, and it keeps your main thing the main thing. For me, at my life stage, my children are now grown. I wake up early in the morning, I have a coffee, and I focus on writing for the first hour. If it's a good day, maybe 2 hours. And then and only then will I have breakfast or open my email or do other things. That is a sacrosanct hour that really helps me, regardless of what happens through the rest of the day, feel like I had a productive day. And it recognizes that short bursts are often best. You don't need long stretches of uninterrupted time, but it's the daily ritual that can count. And what I think you find in early career in your first year or 2 or 3 as a lecturer is that academia is like a pie eating contest. I don't know if you have these in China, but this is kind of an American saying, I guess. A pie eating contest where first prize is more pie, meaning if you're successful, what happens? You get more work to be more successful. And this can be a problem because you can quickly get overwhelmed. And how do you survive this? Well, you survive it with your values of what's enough. And no one ever tells you in early career, oh, that's enough. It's always a more kind of culture that we have currently in academia. So this idea that values get you to what's enough, they save you from the pie eating contest, especially when coming to comparison with others. So you're secure in how you think and what you do. And I think a lot of this comes down to your ethics as well. We don't teach ethics so much, but it's things like your honesty, your integrity, your fairness, your concern for others, your respect for others. It's thinking about, something as simple as, how would you feel if what you were about to write in an email or do in your analysis was to be on the front page of your local newspaper? That's the best litmus test, I think, for knowing what is right, what is wrong in the context of how you're navigating these first few years, where many gray areas are going to come up in terms of things that you're doing in your scientific career, in your teaching, and so on. All right, let me try to wrap up. This early career goes really fast, and it really comes down, whether you're a PhD student, postdoc, or young professor, about ruthless time management, meaning having that focus and hard work combination. You can all work hard, but those that can balance focus and hard work really accelerate. And again, this idea of great people have great ethics and great values. And again, these ethics that I talked about earlier are really so important to the scientific enterprise and you as a scientist. And to enjoy the journey along the way. And to do that, it's combining self-care, it's exercise, it's going on walks, it's getting enough sleep, it's being curious, being social, having interactions socially with friends, being thankful that you're at Beijing Forestry University, so fortunate, and bathing yourself in that gratitude. This can really, I think, help enjoy the journey and counter some of those things in the recent study of the Belgian PhD students I mentioned. So I'll leave it there, and happy to take any questions that you might have. But we've talked about these 3 main topics. Of course, there's many other topics. There's about 20 chapters in this little book. This little book might take you a couple of hours to read. It's very short. And if you're interested, there's some ordering information there, and you can find other information off of my website if you just type my name into Bing or whatever search engine you use. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.